Hey everybody, in this episode of the show, I get really freaking nerdy and talk all about a neurotransmitter that you may know called dopamine. I say you may know it, but you probably have no damn idea what dopamine actually is or what it does. And that's why I'm talking all about it today. It is prompted by a listener question about dopamine and how it interacts with their particular mental health disorder. So we're going to dive into neurotransmitters, into synapses and neurons, into neurobiology, into habit formation, into addictions, and into trichotillomania, also known as hair pulling disorder. So if that sounds interesting to you, buckle up. Let's get going. This is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Duff. I'm a clinical psychologist and a self-help author from Southern California. My goal is to make mental health content for real people, just like you. And in this show, I answer your questions or dive deep into topics related to life, psychology, mental health, relationships, and more. Please be aware that sometimes I use some spicy language, and I also don't shy away from sensitive topics, but I will try to give you a content warning whenever it's relevant. So if all this sounds good to you, let's get started. All right, hello friends of all varieties. This is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast, episode 380. Thank you so much for tuning in, and hello everybody. Welcome to 2024. Happy New Year. I hope that you're having a great start to your year. If you haven't yet listened to the last episode from a couple weeks ago, make sure you do. That'll help you learn a little bit more about me, about how I'm approaching the year. I share my word for the year, which was either connection or connect, something to that effect. I can't even remember, but I'm trying to connect more this year. And hopefully you enjoy the refresh of the podcast format. I was doing a little bit of kind of market research recently and seeing what's going on out there in the podcast world, and I figured it would be a good time to do just a bit of a refresh and polish up of the format. So let me know how you like it. And now would be a wonderful time, if you have not yet, help me out by leaving a review or sharing the podcast with somebody in your life. If there's an episode that has helped you personally, please consider sharing it. Maybe that could be on social media, or if there's an episode that you think might benefit somebody that you know in your life, send it to them. I've had some really interesting conversations with people and some really awesome experiences where somebody was sent an episode by a friend or family member, and it really resonated with them, and they emailed me or sent a message to thank me and talk about it. So you'd be surprised how much that can be really helpful. Today I'm going to start off the year with a really interesting deep dive prompted by a question. If you have a question you would like me to take on the show, please send me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com or go to duffthepsych.com and use the contact form there. But here's the question that prompted this episode. He reads, "Forgive me if you've addressed this topic already. I did a search and couldn't find any episodes that specifically address this. Have you ever done an episode or blog post about dopamine? Supposedly, it's the key to everything, right? It's supposed to be why we scroll our phones, to get a hit of dopamine, other things like video games, TV, streaming series, etc., all dopamine, right? I have a mild case of trichotillomania. That's about dopamine too, right? What does that mean, and what are the alternatives? Also, what does it mean if someone is taking a dopamine reuptake inhibitor like Wellbutrin? If I still have trichotillomania behaviors, does that mean that Wellbutrin isn't working?" So before diving in, I just want to say I love this question, and I want to encourage all of you to send in more questions or topics like this. Even if you don't have a specific issue in your life that you need advice about, if there are topics that you're curious about, terms that you've heard people throwing around, something that you just want to know more about, please send on over as well, in addition to questions about your life, relationships, etc. I'm happy to cover any and all of those. And I'm also really glad to answer this question because this taps into a little bit of a frustration of mine. One thing I've noticed in the past few years is that the understanding of mental health, neurology, psychiatry, all of that sort of thing, it's definitely, I don't want to say the understanding is increased. The awareness and the interest is increased, but the actual information has kind of become like memified. By that, I mean, you see these memes out there, right? I'm thinking of the dude, beating his drum from that movie. I forget what it is, but it's a Wes Anderson movie. He's beating that drum and it's like my last molecule of serotonin, right? Or there's these viral articles every few years about somebody going on a dopamine fast. And I think it really creates a lot of confusion about what these molecules actually are and what they actually do in your body. And I think essentially people use, serotonin as a shorthand for happiness and dopamine as a shorthand for things like reward or addiction or pleasure. And honestly, this is just a very inadequate way of looking at them, So for example, what if I told you that having too little dopamine would prevent you from even being able to move your body, especially in a coordinated way? Or what if I told you that too much serotonin might cause you to have severe muscle rigidity and insane fevers? These are all things that can happen. So it's more complicated than you would think. Let's get into it. Now, there's no way to get around having to define some terminology here. This is going to be a fairly nerdy episode. So please buckle up and be ready for that. The first thing that we should explain is what dopamine even is. So dopamine is something called a neurotransmitter. If you break that term down, you can probably figure out what it is, right? Neurotransmit. In your brain, there are cells that send signals back and forth, and these are called neurons. You've probably seen them before. They have kind of a body of the cell, a long projection, and then these little things that come off of it, and that's how they communicate with each other. And your neurons, they accomplish this communication by sending little chemical messengers back and forth from one to the other. And there's these little spaces in between, and those little spaces between one neuron and the other are called the synapse. So if you hear something like synaptic or, increasing synapse connections, etc., that's just meaning the space between two neurons where they send those messages back and forth in the form of these chemicals, which we call neurotransmitters. So one neuron will release a neurotransmitter out of it that floats across the synapse, and then it tries to find a receptor site on the other neuron. And if it can attach to that receptor site, then it causes some action to occur. And dopamine is one example of a neurotransmitter. You probably heard of a few other well-known ones. For example, serotonin, as we talked about already, is one. There are also things like acetylcholine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, gamma aminobutyric acid, which is GABA, even easier to say GABA, and also glutamate, which is a very excitatory neurotransmitter. Those are a few you may have heard of, but there are actually more than that. There's other ones like, for instance, histamine can be considered a neurotransmitter. Glycine can also be considered a neurotransmitter. One interesting thing about neurotransmitters is that it's more a description of the function of the molecule, right? It's what the molecule does. That's why it's called a neurotransmitter rather than the actual type of molecule. Because there are some molecules that can serve other functions as well. So for example, let's take epinephrine, which is what we might think of as adrenaline. So epinephrine is a neurotransmitter, but it's also sometimes released into the bloodstream by glands, your adrenal glands. And when that happens, rather than being in the brain, it's considered a hormone. So epinephrine can be a neurotransmitter or it can be a hormone depending on where it is and how it's used in the body. So yeah, it can be multiple things. So all of this is to say that the science of molecules in the body, especially neurotransmitters, is massively complex and more than we're going to get into here. I'm not even going to get into the fact that neurotransmitters as we know them, like dopamine or serotonin, they aren't even one single entity. There are multiple variations. There are different types of receptor sites. So basically what I'm saying is that when we reduce dopamine down to just the feel-good molecule, it can be a bit misleading. Now, let's address some of the specifics in your question. You mentioned dopamine is supposedly the key to everything, right? And I think what you're getting at here is that dopamine is an important factor in the brain's reward system. That's what it's really known for. And it is true that dopamine is released during pleasurable activities, which is a way for the brain to reinforce behaviors that are essential for survival, like things such as eating or socializing. This is very much a microcosm or an internal version of what you might think of as reinforcement-based learning. If you're training a dog and they do something that you want them to do, you reward them with a treat, they're going to be more likely to do that activity. And so similarly in the brain, when you're rewarded for doing things that promote survival or other things that, maybe eventually become addictions, which we'll talk about, and you get rewarded for that internally, you're going to be more likely to do it. So, in modern times, things like watching TV or playing video games, those do activate dopamine release, but it's much more complex than you would think. Here's the thing. Technically, in these cases, dopamine isn't what makes you feel pleasure, right? That's what we think of, though. We think of, okay, dopamine, hit of dopamine, right? That word is everywhere. Dopamine isn't the thing that makes you feel pleasure. It's actually what makes you feel the anticipation of a reward. So if I'm talking to you right now and I hear my phone or I feel my phone buzz in my pocket, dopamine is going to increase in anticipation of a potentially rewarding message. And then it also plays a role in your motivation to pursue rewards. So it's much more about the learning there. Let's take a concrete example. So when somebody gambles, let's say they're playing slot machines or, playing blackjack or something like that, and they happen to win, they're going to get a rush of things like endorphins, which are other neurotransmitters. They're going to get a rush of endorphins, and that contributes to the feeling of euphoria that happens when they win. And then from there, the dopamine is released in the future in anticipation of that potential reward, saying, oh, when we do this thing, we might get a hit of endorphins. So let's increase that anticipation. And that happens whether you win or you lose. Actually, the uncertainty of reward in Vegas, right? Not sure if you're going to win or not, that actually increases the dopamine release, because if you knew that you were going to win every 5 times, it wouldn't build up until you get to the 4th or 5th time. But since it's random, it's going to be higher and higher all the time until that thing happens. Something we call a variable reinforcement schedule in, cognitive science or behavioral science. I want to talk more about the role of dopamine and then get into more specifics for the question. But first, let's take a quick break and talk about today's sponsor. Okay, this episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. It's the new year, and a lot of us are thinking about, new year, new me. What can we change? What can we do differently? But I think it's equally important to think about what we want to continue doing. It's very hard to, bring about new things or shave away things that we're doing. Instead, amplifying things that are already happening is a very, very powerful tool for mental health and for just keeping yourself going. I know for me, one of the things that I really want to keep from last year is more of a focus on slowing down and introspecting, whether that's journaling, whether that's just sort of talking to myself in the shower, in the car, taking those moments to really look deep and give myself the space to understand my internal processes better. So you can think about that for yourself. Maybe there are some things like related to your physical health or what you've done for your job or your physical space that you want to continue and build upon. And one great way to do that is with therapy. So if you're thinking of trying out therapy, give BetterHelp a shot. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge if you need to. So celebrate the progress you've already made. Visit betterhelp.com/Duff and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Duff. Okay, let's get back to the question here. So as I was getting at, dopamine is actually very crucial in the learning process. When an action leads to a rewarding outcome, such as that euphoria caused when you win in a slot machine or something like that, dopamine release strengthens the pathways that lead to that behavior. So it's going to be more likely that you repeat that behavior in the future. And in some cases, when that pathway gets too strong, along with other factors, that can lead to addiction. Now, when it comes to things like social media and video games, there are also plenty of other factors that come into play beyond just dopamine. One thing to keep in mind is that another form of reinforcement is what we call negative reinforcement. That doesn't mean bad sort of reinforcement. That means being reinforced by taking away something bad or uncomfortable. So in this case, in addition to feeling good from engaging in an activity, using social media or video games might give you the opportunity to avoid feeling bad by reducing the attention that you're paying to the stressful things in your life or the negative aspects of your environment. Right? Think about a kid who is in a household that's tumultuous or abusive, and they have, a Nintendo or I almost said like Nintendo DS or Game Boy. What is it? Switch, Nintendo Switch, or a PC or something where they can put on their headphones and they can escape. And that's a type of reinforcement because they're taking away the bad things of their normal life and they get to escape for that period of time. So there's really a strong pull from the environment to do more of that activity. And also, you have to realize it's not necessarily just a dopamine issue that might cause somebody to be addicted, in air quotes, to their phone, but it's also very much related to how the thing itself is structured. Imagine if food had no immediate negative consequences, meaning you could eat as much as you want, You're not going to feel full. You're not going to feel sick. You're not going to have any sort of weight gain or negative health consequences. You just keep getting rewarded every time you ate. You keep getting that good feeling from having a great meal or something very tasty or salty or sweet. And there was just a constant, infinite source of food at your disposal. You pull something out of your fridge, it gets refilled right back up. Then you would probably just start eating compulsively, right? There's really not much risk to it. So, in this case, you wouldn't want to jump to the conclusion that somebody's dopamine system is unregulated. Rather, the activity itself is just rife for compulsive behavior. And dopamine, of course, plays a role in that. But, things like apps with, microtransactions or things with notifications, these are all ubiquitous in our lives now. They're everywhere. And these structures are driven by money and algorithms that are designed to get you more and more engaged and more reliant on them. And they're also much lower effort than other activities, right? It feels great and euphoric to eat a nice meal with friends or have sex with somebody or hit a runner's high from pushing yourself several miles beyond where you normally do. But those take a lot of effort. Those take a lot of time. And now you have other options for engagement that give you that satisfaction or that escape that don't take the same sort of willpower and effort. So the barrier to entry is very low. So of course you're going to be going toward that, or at least there is a pull to go toward that. So those are some of the things that are involved in, habit formation, in addiction, in compulsive behaviors that don't all have to do with dopamine, but dopamine is something that underlies most of those. Now, it also has other functions. Beyond just the reward system in your brain, dopamine is also central to coordinating smooth and controlled muscle movements. There's a portion of your brain called the basal ganglia, and deficiency of dopamine in this area, especially a very specific area called the substantia nigra, this leads to symptoms that are common in Parkinsonism. So if you've ever seen someone with Parkinson's disease or something similar, they might have a tremor in their hands or legs or face. They might have muscle stiffness and rigidity. They might have trouble with coordination, picking up their feet and not tripping. They might freeze sometimes. And that's all because there's not enough dopamine there. It also plays a critical role in thinking, especially executive functioning, which are kind of your frontal lobe activities. Things like decision-making, planning ahead, problem-solving. It helps to dilate blood vessels in the body, which regulates blood flow and blood pressure. It's essential for learning and memory. It helps to regulate emotional responses, and too much dopamine, especially in that frontal lobe, can lead to psychosis like you see in schizophrenia. And I could go on. That's maybe half of the role of the things that dopamine does in your brain, right? It is very, very prolific. It has a lot of different impacts depending on where in your brain, which receptor site, etc. So don't assume that dopamine is just the feel-good molecule. Technically, it's not even the feel-good molecule. It's the help you learn to do more things that bring about the feel-good molecules. And it has a million other purposes as well. I told you this would get nerdy. So let's get back to the question itself and talk a little bit about the specific concern regarding trichotillomania. And I might refer to it as trick instead of trichotillomania because that's a mouthful. But trichotillomania is also known as hair pulling disorder. It's a mental health condition in which people have the recurrent urge to pull out their hair. And that can be anywhere in the body. It can be in the scalp. It can be in the eyebrows or eyelashes. It could be other parts of the body. In some cases, people will just pick it. In some cases, people will pick it and also eat the hair follicle. That's kind of a additional part of it. But it's a nuanced disorder, and there's no one specific cause that we know about that brings it about. With trick, there is some evidence to say that dopamine may play a role since it's involved in habit formation and reward-seeking behavior. But aside from dopamine, we think that probably serotonin and glutamate may also be involved because those are linked to obsessive compulsive type behaviors, which trick is similar to. And then, of course, there are also things like genetic predispositions, environmental factors involved. Somebody with a history of trauma might find that hair pulling is a really good way for them to achieve the negative reinforcement, as we talked about, of reducing emotional pain from the trauma. And that leads to the habit being generated, right? So again, imagine that somebody has really intense feelings because of their tumultuous environment, because of trauma that they've been through. And instead of having a flashback and having that intense pain, they can pull out their hair and their mind goes somewhere else. That helps them focus, similar to what you might see in somebody who does a form of self-harm. And that is a way of negatively reinforcing that behavior, right? It helps you get away from that discomfort, and you are engaging in something that is not necessarily comfortable, but it's much less uncomfortable than the emotional pain you were feeling. And then, of course, you can lead to a habit being generated from that. So dopamine does play a role in the development and the maintenance of trichotillomania because of its role in learning and habit formation. And then, of course, the anticipation of that negative reinforcement or positive reinforcement. But there are other pieces of the puzzle as well. It's not just all about dopamine. Now, you asked about Wellbutrin, and that's a medication. The generic version is called bupropion. Either one, you might find somebody, getting the brand name or the generic version. But it's a medication that is primarily designed to treat depression and also to help with breaking habits like smoking. It is FDA approved for smoking cessation, which just means, quitting smoking. And it's different from other types of antidepressants because a lot of those primarily work on serotonin. So rather than being an SSRI or something like that, it is what's called an NDRI. So Wellbutrin is a norepinephrine dopamine reuptake inhibitor. I know this is a lot of neurobiology, but remember, norepinephrine and dopamine are two different molecules than what we normally see in SSRIs like Lexapro or, SNRIs. So what it does, though, is rather than reducing the amount of dopamine in your brain, which you might think of, right? If you're thinking, okay, I'm going to quit smoking, that means I need less dopamine, so I get less of those dopamine hits, as you're thinking. No, it actually increases the amount of dopamine in your brain, right? This is why it's helpful in improving motivation and reducing fatigue in people with depression. Basically, rather than allowing the dopamine and the norepinephrine that are floating there in the synapse between those neurons to get sucked back up, because we like recycling things in our brain, rather than getting sucked back up into the neurons, it stops that from happening. And so it lingers there in the synapse and has a better chance of connecting to a receptor. So essentially, there's more available dopamine and more available norepinephrine in your brain. So it's really, really interesting how it helps with the smoking, right? It's not because it reduces the amount of dopamine in the reward pathway. It's actually because it essentially replaces the role of the nicotine. When you stop smoking, you would normally have some withdrawal effects and cravings, and you would be sort of jonesing for a cigarette because your body wants that nicotine and wants that reward. And since your dopamine reward pathway is already being stimulated by the Wellbutrin, you don't have that buildup of anticipation of the reward from nicotine. And so those symptoms are not as present, and that helps you break the habit, right? It's not making you, have the same sort of, how would I say it? It's not making you feel any less reward from things. It's just sort of replacing the anticipation that you would have for the nicotine. And instead, it's just already fulfilling that. So when you take away the nicotine, it's not as big of a deal, right? Hopefully that makes sense. I know it's a little complicated, but it's important to understand that it's actually increasing dopamine, not decreasing it. Your brain isn't relying on nicotine to provide that reward. Therefore, the desire to smoke is decreased. And so that combined with the increase in motivation that can happen with Wellbutrin can help to break that particular habit. Now, there is an argument to be made, okay, am I just trading one thing for another? But obviously Wellbutrin is very different from, getting addicted to cigarettes or something like that. Now, when it comes to trichotillomania, the research in treating it with Wellbutrin is limited. I think it makes intuitive sense that you might want to use Wellbutrin for trich since it's associated with those compulsive habits and it kind of feels similar to smoking or another kind of addiction. But honestly, the neurobiological factors behind trich are not really well understood, and it likely varies on a person-to-person basis. So Wellbutrin may be considered as a medication, particularly for those people who don't respond to other medications like SSRIs. As I mentioned, there are other factors involved with the disorder, things like the environment and associated mental health concerns. So, for example, if your tendency to pick at your hair is highly tied to your level of anxiety, an SSRI might help reduce that anxiety significantly, which then in turn gives you less of a reason to do that picking or that pulling. And so in that way, it doesn't directly address the issue, but it does sort of indirectly. So your question, right, about the Wellbutrin and your trichotillomania is that, your symptoms persisting isn't necessarily a sign that your Wellbutrin is not working, but it may also be the case that your Wellbutrin isn't actually supposed to be treating it. This is something that you'd want to talk with your doctor about. There are no current FDA-approved medications for the treatment of trichotillomania. However, there are other medications out there in the literature that do have more support than Wellbutrin. I wouldn't even say that that's the front runner. So I would suggest talking to your doctor about your specific concerns to see if there are adjustments to your medications that may be more helpful. And as well, I think it could be really helpful for you in particular to work with a therapist if you're not already doing that, especially somebody who has experience in treating trichotillomania, because there are behavioral strategies, there are better coping strategies for anxiety and things like that that will make up half or more of the battle in trying to put a dent in this thing. So yeah, that basically covers it. This was a relatively quick episode, but we covered a lot of information. If you don't remember everything, that's totally fine. You can go back, you can rewind, you can go to the website and find the show notes. That's going to be at duffthepsych.com/episode 380, and I'll have everything kind of listed out there. But hopefully this helped you learn a little bit more about what neurotransmitters are, what dopamine is, and why you shouldn't let TikTok lead you to oversimplify very complex mechanisms in our bodies. So I hope that helps. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see ya. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode. If you would like to send a question or a topic for a future episode, please email me at duffthepsych@gmail.com. If you like my approach and would like to learn more about my books, online course, or other resources, please head over to my website at duffthepsych.com. And lastly, it would mean so much to me if you would leave a review for the podcast wherever you listen to it, or share an episode with a friend. Until next time, you got this.